This is the war in Russia through the eyes of Otto Carius, one of Germany's most distinguished tank commanders. This is the battle at Newel on the Eastern Front. Let's begin. The front had quieted down to a certain extent on Lake Ladoga, yet before we could properly catch our breath, a new march order surprised us. Area of operations, the area around Newel. The Russians had attacked there suddenly and taken Newel. The attack had arrived so unexpectedly that some of our troops were caught at the movies. There was a real panic. As was only right, the commandant of Newel had to answer to a court-martial later for gross negligence in his security measures, and we were given the mission to hold open the Rollbahn at all costs so that the infantry could occupy the best positions possible east of the road. Ivan was, after all, supposed to be pushed back again. We soon recognized what type of an opponent we were dealing with through some unforeseen events. There had been a gap in our front lines south of Newel since the winter of 1941-42. It was considered to be a natural obstacle because the terrain was an out-and-out marsh. To everyone's surprise, after the breakthrough to Newel, it was determined that the Russians had succeeded in slipping smaller units through the marsh to harass the Rollbahn. I was thus sent out ahead as a single tank to provide cover. The rest of the company was supposed to follow. Nothing could be seen of the enemy. The Rollbahn we had to hold open stretched in front of us from the right to the left. It rose upward toward the right and disappeared behind high ground after about 2,000 meters. The rest of our battalion was supposed to advance to us from that direction and reinforce our line between Loez and Newel. It was November 4th. We had left our tank. My driver, Unteroffizier Kostler, worked on the damaged left track. We were thus standing in the open and noted with satisfaction that our tanks were rolling toward us on the Rollbahn over the previously mentioned high ground. My radio operator hadn't made any report to the contrary to me at any rate. When I identified the first tanks more clearly, I was startled. Infantry was sitting on them. Binoculars out, yes indeed, the Russians were personally paying their respects. As fast as lightning, everyone was back in his seat, but they didn't even take notice of us. They probably thought we were a knocked-out vehicle and weren't counting on enemy contact. My driver, K. Sixtler, practically ruined the whole thing. He always saw red whenever tanks showed up. The firing couldn't start fast enough for him. He would have preferred to ram them. He had already started the engine. He repeatedly demanded that we start firing. He couldn't understand our quiet at all. My gunner, Unteroffizier Plunges, had been one of those older university students who enjoyed his drinking. Compared to his former superiors, I got along quite well with him. Unfortunately, we soon had to part company because his request to return to his studies had been approved. I hope that he has his diploma on the wall, despite his liking of the god Bacchus, and that today he holds the position of a chief engineer somewhere. Just as I wanted to call out, "Open fire," K. Sixtler lost his nerves and attempted to move out. The first Russians were no more than 60 meters away from us. Just in the nick of time, Plunges cleaned their clock with a round between the turret and the hull. The tank turned off into the ditch and smoldered. There were no more signs of life from the crew. The Russian infantry scattered in the countryside next to the Rollbahn. Plunges was then occupied with the remainder of the enemy tanks. They ran into one another in a wild panic, turned around, and didn't think at all about initiating a fight with us. Only 2 of the 12 T-34s escaped our fire. In the evening, I was called back to the north. We were supposed to conduct a small operation at Shelkunica. Flak personnel took over our security duties at the old position. After 2 days, I had returned. To reinforce me, I received a tank from the 3rd Company. Feldwebel Dittmar was its commander. We weren't counting on any more Russian tanks after the enemy had suffered such a thrashing. As usual, however, we had underestimated Ivan's stubbornness. He arrived at noontime at the exact same spot as he did 2 days before. This time, though, he had closed his hatches in preparation for combat and turned his turrets halfway to the right. By all appearances, however, he had only identified the flak piece and completely overlooked us, the main culprits. The enemy tanks made efforts to detour around their burned-out vehicles. There were 5 of them. They made the big mistake of all driving at the same time and just observing the high ground. When they fired, very inaccurately by the way, They also woke up the flak crew, which had counted completely on us. We knocked out 3 tanks. The rudely awakened flak took care of the rest. Right afterwards, we took a short recon probe to the hill. The Russians had actually brought additional material through the path less marsh. In the evening, we returned to our old position. There, we received the mission to occupy the village behind that high ground the next morning. We were thus supposed to open the way for an infantry regiment. 2 more tanks and 3 20mm quad flak guns were attached to me at the onset of darkness. The latter proved themselves magnificently in action against ground targets. It was a moonlit night. I decided to attack as soon as possible. I assumed that the enemy's surprise would compensate somewhat for our numerical inferiority. We formed up so my Tiger drove point. The tanks and the quads alternated behind it. Using our blackout lights, we approached quite close to the village. Amazingly enough, not a shot was fired. Ivan probably assumed we were one of his own march columns. We stopped just before the village and the quads opened fire. Against my orders, a gunner also fired on the houses left of the Rollbahn. The result was that the easterly wind blew the dense smoke over the street and blocked our sight. In the village, we rolled over 3 Russian AT guns located quietly next to houses. We dispersed to provide security and establish contact with the regiment. It now approached, combed the houses, and in the morning was able to continue its way north. The raid succeeded without any losses on our own side. Only 2 Russian tanks were able to get away. If we had waited until day to move, the enemy would have brought down a lot of fear on us, as we were able to determine from the material we had captured. Despite all precautions and despite all attempts to seal them off, the Russians had succeeded in continuing to infiltrate our front through the old gap. They had built a long, thin pipeline through which they pumped more and more men and material. With our weak forces, we were not in position to seal off this penetrated area, cut off the Russians, and eradicate the ensuing pocket. The danger became greater every day that the pipeline would burst and that the Russians would encircle us. That was the question that was often asked during the Russian campaign. Who is encircling whom? We were therefore withdrawn to the west in order to prevent any further advances from out of the pipeline. The terrain was simply not suited for tankers. Despite the frost and the snow, there were stretches of marsh everywhere where we could get bogged down. We didn't care for the woods very much either. But compared to conditions in the northern sector of the Eastern Front, we thought we had it quite good there. On November 10th, we made a counterattack at Pugatchina and cut off an outgrowth of the pipeline. Our route went through about 5 kilometers of alpine forest where the Russians had recently captured 2 German long-barreled 8S emitter Pak guns. We found these guns, intact and unused. Clearly, Ivan didn't know how to use them. There was nothing left for us to do but blow those undamaged guns to bits. We didn't want to give the Russians yet another opportunity to test their penetrating capabilities on us. We were somewhat careless when we continued to advance after that, and there was soon the crack of cannon fire coming from some direction. One of our vehicles was immediately engulfed in flames. Fortunately, the crew could save themselves by getting into another tank. We moved out rapidly to get back to the main road again. In spite of everything, we had determined that the enemy had only advanced with light forces in this area. All in all, however, the situation remained unclear. Even at higher levels, no one could give us information about the exact position of the battle lines. We had an experience during this time where we didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. A horse-mounted messenger approached us while we were on a security patrol. We drove slowly so as not to make the horse nervous, but when we were even with them, the young horse began to prance. Unfortunately, it jumped so close in front of the left track that my driver couldn't brake fast enough. The animal was so severely hurt that the rider, who was able to jump off, had to give him the coup de grace. We took him aboard and brought him to his unit. There I said for the record that he was not responsible for the incident in any manner. When we drove back, the dead horse had disappeared. I found it again at our field mess. My people had hauled it on a tank. Our rather meager rations were enriched by it, especially since the meat could be stored for days due to the cold. The next evening we had meatballs. Unaware of the incident, our commander ate 3 pieces and praised the kitchen for its taking care of us. When I blurted out the truth to him, however, The poor man actually had to vomit. For many days afterwards, until he was certain that the last bit of horse meat had been consumed, he only ate meatless meals. Trouble began to brew again a few days later. We were pulling security on a slight rise from which we could get a good glimpse of the village of Sergeyevo. The village itself was in our hands, but behind it were the Russians. We were supposed to help beat back an expected attack. Toward evening, Ivan actually did move from out of the woods with 4 tanks and infantry. It was easy to repulse the attack from our elevated position. The tank commanders even stood outside their tanks during the engagement and directed fire. 4 T-34s went up in flames. At that point, the Russians pulled back into the woods. The fighting didn't stop until the end of the year. On November 25th, we had to support 1 battalion from the 503rd Infantry Regiment in its attack against some woods to the west of Sergeyevo. According to the plan, it started at dawn. Our 4 tanks had occupied their positions, and we saw, somewhat surprised, that our infantry comrades were rushing upright toward the wood line. We admired their elan, but were even more surprised that the Russians allowed it to occur without any interference. After we had advanced about 70 meters, we found the solution to the mystery. The men who were hurrying to the woods were not our comrades, after all, but Russians who had dug in during the night. They were clearing out prior to our attack. Our foot soldiers were on line with us to the right and left and were waiting for our involvement. Ivan had the incredible good fortune that we had deceived ourselves in the morning twilight. We then had to slug it out with them in the woods, when we could have finished them off without any problems in the open field. The battalion commander, Hauptmann Johann Meyer, was severely wounded in the evening by a Soviet sniper in the trees. We all feared he wouldn't reach the main aid station alive because he was shot in the lungs. Because of that, I was even happier when I received greetings from him in the hospital in 1944. Just prior to his severe wounding, he had become the 329th soldier to be awarded the Oak Leaves to the Knight's Cross. Because of his wounding, he almost didn't get to participate in his own award ceremony. On December 2nd, I was employed with Oberfeldwebel Zveti at Gorushka in order to cut off some more of the pipeline via an advance with the infantry. The Russians had dug themselves in extremely well on a small but commanding rise. They had always been masters at that. Beyond the hill and to each side of it, they had set up heavy weapons such as AT guns, mortars, and the like. We could not engage them. We had to drive along a trail, which led to a completely impassable bridge. The Russians had a tremendous line of sight and greeted us with mortar attacks. I could have killed the commander of the engineers, a Hauptmann. While the bridge was certainly not negotiable, he had assured us that we could easily get through the ditch on the right-hand side. Understandably, he didn't want to reinforce the bridge right in the line of sight of the enemy. But I had just as little desire to remain stuck in the ditch and perform an unnecessary recovery in front of the Russians. The Hauptmann soon appeared and demanded that I immediately initiate the attack. One word led to another, and Ivan accompanied our harsh words with a little friendly fire. When he finally started talking about malingering, cowardice, and so on, I abruptly ripped my iron cross from my jacket and tossed it at his feet. I mounted up and drove off. I immediately got bogged down so firmly and deeply that I could easily reach the ground with a single step from the turret. The Hauptmann had been taught a lesson. He had also vanished into thin air, as they say. Not that I could blame him, since Ivan, who had observed our senseless undertaking at close range, could have practically fired down our turret hatches. I waved to Zveti, and we hooked up the cable. It was really more luck than anything else that nothing else happened. Only a piece of shrapnel from a mortar round disfigured my temple. Like a fool, I let my gunner pull it out after we had got our vehicle free again. It required backing up and a lot of effort. The wound began to bleed like crazy. Apparently, a larger vein had been ripped open, and Zveti had to apply an expert pressure dressing. Our first aid instruction proved itself well. I now had a fine white turban on me. It helped serve as wonderful camouflage in the snow-covered landscape. We had already painted the tanks white, as was usual in winter. My head scarcely stuck out at greater distances, a blessing in disguise. That evening, the engineer captain sent me my award along with a letter. He apologized and also assured me that the bridge would be negotiable by the following morning. We did, in fact, cross the bone of contention in the early morning light without major problems. It swayed a little bit, to be sure, but it still held. Using luck and skill, we crossed a minefield. I had Zweti drive in my tracks behind me. We were then right in front of the Russians. We could see into their foxholes on the forward slope. We then gave our infantry a little breathing room. Zweti quickly finished off the 2 AT guns that had covered the mines. The guys to our right then began firing point blank at us with AT rifles. None of the vision blocks were functioning anymore after a short period of time. Zweti tried in vain to find one of the riflemen, but those guys always went to other positions and then disappeared again as fast as lightning. We reconned by fire along the entire length of the earthen fortifications. The Russians were so sure of themselves, however, that they even threw hand grenades out from under their cover. When we advanced a little, the first AT round was already hissing past my head. It seemed senseless to move ahead anymore until after the infantry had advanced to us. We thus stood there for a few hours without seeing anything of our comrades. They didn't exit their foxholes at all, because Ivan controlled the entire area from the trees. Even we had to button up, since we feared that the Russians could shoot us from above. In the afternoon, Zweti pointed out to me that a puddle was under the rear of my tank. I didn't have a good feeling. The driver started up the motor, and the thermometer immediately climbed to more than 250 degrees. The Russians had shot a hole in the radiator with their AT rifles and mortars. What could be done? Jumping ship or towing was impossible in our situation. We therefore had to try to get back over the bridge under our own power and without the pistons freezing up. Misery loves company. Zweti had forgotten to switch back to receive. That meant that I got a splendid reception of the conversation in his tank, something which was of little interest to me that time. Those are the things that make one realize just how necessary the hated battle drills are. It was beat into a radio operator's head a dozen times a day to switch back to receive immediately after transmitting a radio call, and then, in this situation, it still didn't work. I began to wave from the hatch with my headphones in order to point out to Zweti that I wanted to talk to him. There wasn't any time to lose because of the steadily leaking radiator. He finally noticed my waving and rudely awakened his radio operator, something which I could also hear. I directed the driver of my wingman through the mines. He had to drive blind backwards, but he guided us through. With a great deal of anxiety, we reached the bridge. It had already suffered due to our first crossing. It was sagging in the middle. We crossed our fingers and were able to do it. Mitter, about 100 meters, we were protected from the Russian sight by low, marshy woods. We never again attempted an attack at that location. It was simply impossible for the infantry. No one could reach that hill alive, even though it was so palpably close in front of us. On December 12th, we were sent to Loez on the Vitebsk-Newel rollbahn. The Russians were exerting pressure from the east on a broad front against our lines there. During the first couple of days, we only had one mission. We had to drive a few kilometers up and down along the rollbahn to feign larger panzer formations to the Russians. On December 16th, using armor support, the enemy attempted to attack over the hill where we had knocked out a Russian anti-tank gun a few weeks before. We immediately launched a successful counterattack. Many enemy tanks were knocked out by us in the process. Ivan could have avoided these losses if he had moved over the hill en masse with his tanks. They felt their way forward, however, somewhat anxiously and one after another. We had an easy time with them. On the other hand, we had a lot of trouble with the Russian fighters. They lurched past us almost without a break. That's really the way one has to describe that type of flying. My gunner, Unteroffizier Kramer, can take credit for a deed that was probably unparalleled on the Eastern Front. That is, he succeeded in shooting down a Russian fighter with the tank cannon. Of course, he was also helped by chance. This was how it happened. Kramer, upset by the unrelenting nuisance of these guys, elevated his cannon along the approach route. I talked him in. He took a chance and pulled the trigger. On the second attempt, he hit one of the bees in its wing. The Russian crashed behind us. On the same day, we received yet another breather. 2 Russians collided and tore each other apart before crashing. In the evening, I had a situation briefing with the regimental commander of the infantry. It took longer than expected. I was finally able to start back around 2 o'clock in the morning. On the way, I found our infantry in front of the Rollbahn. They were just settling down. Occasionally, the Russians fired over the road with a carbine or a machine gun. Just before the point where I knew my tanks were, I quietly walked along the road leading south, that is, toward home. The tank crews had shrunk down to 2 men per vehicle. They were looking for me. My long absence had upset them. We were very happy to see one another again. Sveti told me that our front lines had been lost on the stretch of Rollbahn I had walked down. The road was in no man's land. In the meantime, the enemy was continuously bringing up reinforcements. Only with difficulty could our position be held much longer. Russian troops and materiel were arriving from the east in trucks that had their headlights on. They were unconcerned about our countermeasures. Our artillery fire came sparingly, and not until after the enemy columns had already disappeared. The next day, we once again attacked along the Rollbahn leading north. We wanted to make it possible for our infantry to win back the position vacated the previous day. The Russians were already just to the right of the road. A Stalin organ located in the open registered on us. My tank was hit in the front by a rocket. Using the radio, Zweti asked what had happened. At first, he couldn't recognize anything in the smoke. We had been lucky. We then cleared out quickly from the enemy's line of sight. Despite repeated attempts, our infantry wasn't able to advance to the east over the Rollbahn. The Russians, on the other hand, began crossing over from the other side. During the process, we were able to admire the composure of a Soviet commissar who stood upright in the midst of the fire and stubbornly waved his men on. The machine guns appeared unable to touch him. We flew into a rage, and Kramer blew him into the air with the 88. The Russians then ran back across the Rollbahn again. Despite that, our attack was called off. A new front line was set up farther west. When I got back to the regimental command post, the commander was in an uproar. 2 Alsatians had disappeared. Actually, at that point in the war, they weren't supposed to be used at the front anymore. Because of their dependability, someone had made an exception, and it was feared they had crossed the lines and spilled the beans. There was another painful incident with 2 captured Russian T-34s. The 2 German tanks were pulling security and came back in the evening twilight. Our PA elements, which had no idea there were German crews inside them, promptly knocked both of them out. The painted-on Balkan cross could no longer be recognized in the dusk. From then on, it was impossible to get any of our men to mount a captured tank. Our days in the Newel sector were numbered. New and difficult missions were waiting for us south of Leningrad. The front at Newel still hadn't settled down when we quickly withdrew to go to the next railhead. We were needed even more for the withdrawal movements in the Leningrad area. Our objective was the choke point of Gatchina on the Leningrad-Narwa road. During our departure from the Newel front, bridges and rail lines were already going up in the air behind us. The front had to be pulled back a good distance again. This concludes the 5th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.